Yeah, I didn't see anyone else before you.
Now, I have a consideration, or even a question, to Marianne Wolf's presentation, which I liked very much. You correctly pointed out the problems connected to the introduction of the new technologies in the so-called problem of critical thinking. Our youngsters are. Now, it seems to me that one of the, not the only one, but one of the main reasons is due to the fact that it was not intended, in my opinion, but one of the results of the introduction of the new technologies has been the substitution of, let's say, correlation to causality. In other words, critical thinking presupposes causal analysis. We need to know what is the cause. Today, causal analysis is disappearing in many fields of inquiry. For instance, in my field, economics, we have invented econometrics. Econometrics establishes only correlations, but not causal relations. And the result is that it can be almost enough. And in fact, the economic theory per se is disappearing. In the last 50 years, not only one economic theory was created. Irrespective of, as we know in the history of economic thought, there are many economic theories. But they were theories based on certain assumption, deduction, and then verification. Now, it seems to me that now the young people are considering that causal analysis is not important. What is important is to establish correlation, because after a while, if you collect an enormous amount of data, that is in fact the impact of big data, there is no need to bother about inquiring about the causes of the events outside. I think, in conclusion, this fact is substituting calculating thought to thinking thought. Thinking thought, if we pay attention, is disappearing, substituted by calculating thought. Because what is important is to calculate, which means to obtain a result, whatever, independent of the fact that the results follows from the premises and is correct from an ethical point of view. So perhaps I would like to know your reaction to this, if you agree or not.
I have three reactions. The first is that if I had given a longer presentation about what goes into critical analysis, it's not unlike the scientific method itself. It requires background knowledge. It requires making an analogy between what you know and what is new. It requires inference, deduction, induction. The integration of all that is the sum that goes into critical analysis. But each of these requires several things that have gone missing. First, when I said background knowledge, we have a tendency in ourselves as well as the young to assume that all we have to do is rely on an external server of knowledge rather than to have built up this knowledge within ourselves. So one problem is that we do not have the same building blocks of conceptual knowledge that is the background knowledge from which analogy comes, from which inference can be made, from which critical analysis can be drawn. So there are many building blocks. When I talk about critical analysis, I'm talking about time in two connotations. One is the milliseconds, the extra milliseconds the brain needs to allocate, and the other is the formation. And I look at Tommy and all of us who are involved in education. It takes time to build background knowledge, inference, analogy, and ultimately critical analysis as a mode of thinking. So there are two aspects to time. One is formative, and one is how we use it. And the other aspect that I would like to suggest to you is that when I say skimming, we all think we know what I mean. But the reality is that skimming is a phenomenon that is very, if you will, ominous to me as a researcher. there is now research on how our graduate students research papers. They read the abstract, and they read the conclusion, and they skip the methods. The methods are what teaches us about causality. The methods are teaching us a mode of thought, of analysis, of inferring truth or non-truth. And that is going missing in the kind of reading even our own graduate students are doing.
Thank you. Thank you all for very, very engaging presentations. I'm going to address my question to you, Marianne, but it is formed by comments that you all made. And it's really about the power of task. Psychologists think a lot about task. So it's really about the power of task coupled to the discernment of the importance of question, which I take the issue of gaze. I'm substituting question for your use of the word gaze. So I wonder what we call deep processing, deep reading, is it less a main effect of opportunity, which digital media give us, and more an effect of, one, the task we choose to engage in, and two, so the weakness that you talk about is discerning when, whether you receive information from print or digital media, discerning when the information is really on point and critical for the task.
Figure this dilemma out, because it is a dilemma that there is no way I will ever do deep reading on anyone's email in this room. It is not appropriate, but it's figuring out exactly when the medium matches the purpose. And that's part of education too. There's something I know Julie Poirot has talked about, and Sam Weinberg. They're talking about digital wisdom, and that's part of the educational process too that I believe that we need. Discernment of truth, discernment of purpose. These are things that take time, but they also take learning, and they require teaching by us.
Please, here, yeah.
Yeah, I enjoyed all these, and I think these papers or talks went together very well. One question I have, which came out of the dinner conversation with Carla last night, is this idea, on the one hand, of franchise and replicability of programs, and on the other, this idea of cultural adaptation, and what stays the same in a program and what varies in a program, because I heard everything from 25 very specific skills and associated activities to something that is kind of a philosophy of teaching, which was maybe more a little bit like the Scholas example, and certainly what has happened in Reggio Emilia. And I know, Carla, you didn't talk that much about specific country examples of like IO2 in Colombia or work in Mozambique or those kinds of things. So I would love to hear maybe it's all of your thoughts around this idea. So the quote from Carla, which I'll remember from last night, was that replication or application should not be a duty, it should be a pleasure, right? So we can think about replication as duty versus pleasure, and so would like each of you to reflect on that.
Thank you for these questions. Thank you, all of you, because if I had the possibility to choose someone else to be with, couldn't be better. So thank you to the organizer, because I felt my message enlarge and expansion of some idea that we try to interpret that don't come from us. They come from the history of humanity, questions that we have to have the courage to renew. And we had, and we should have more and more. And this one remind me when we had to choose how to define a sort of phenomenon that was not anymore involving a public system school in Reggio Emilia for children from 3 months to 6 years, but to try to dialogue with the world that made us in some way interesting for the world, but we had to negotiate how to go to them. And we look at what was going on with other method. The word method is a beautiful word if you look at the Greek roots and so and so. But the way in which it's applied is really a repetition of something that you risk to lose the meaning by, and the big question that you have behind. That's why not to lose the question, not to lose the philosophy, not to lose the reason why, learning, because we learn this continuously by the terrible why of our children that continue to ask why. That means that it is the generative question for being human. After this, we defined, I don't know if it's right, I like your opinion also, approach. What means is an opportunity to remind to the others that Reggio is only an interpretation. We tried to develop our own interpretation with our roots, our cultures, our exchange of some basic questions. That the first one is what does it mean to educate nowadays? That is a permanent question. Where do you educate? Which is the difference between formation and education? What is the meaning of school? Some of the questions that I tried to illustrate before. And that was also a way to invite, you met our beautiful friends in Colombia. We call them friends because we don't have, there is not contract, but there are opportunities that we create. We try to tell them, these are our questions. There are some fundamental values that we ask to share, and some key elements in terms of schooling that are, many of them are in, but they are not so described as in many papers, but they are a sort of manifesto, if I can say, in which I invite you to develop, based on your culture, on your differences, on your uniqueness, something that is strongly related to the place where you are and the culture that you inspired you. This become enormous when you go to countries that are far away from our. That means to go to China, or to be able to dialogue with Mozambique without having an imperialistic, how to be able to learn from them out of a rhetoric of words is not easy.
it's very complex because on the one hand, we at least think equal. This organization is in a hurry because it does want to respect and take very seriously a window of opportunity that has been presented to us called Agenda 2030. So to be responsive to that, we have to responsibly replicate and grow to scale as quickly as we can. There is an urgency. In the creation and design of the program, we brought together 22 experts and ensured that they were from all over the world. So we didn't just have so-called developed countries. You know, we had someone from Kenya and from India and from China, and you know, we really were at pains. Also because one of our endeavors is to teach global citizenship. Well, you cannot teach that and give a country the right to change everything to reflect their country. So there's a tightrope to be walked. We always work with a team of technical experts within each country and sit with them for 5-day workshops. We've done it in Kenya, in Botswana, in South Africa, to adapt the program. But we also, I'm always there at those meetings, and I have my beady eye out for anybody saying, actually, can we do without these books because we're not quite ready as a society for gender equality. So we will not allow the program to be taught in part for reasons of protecting its integrity. Equally, we want countries to own it because they will be more faithful to it if they do. So it's a very complex set of responses, I would say, and thus far, we've had a few requests for changes, but I have to say they are so minimal as to not threaten the competencies we're trying to teach. I mean, Botswana asked us to change the color of a train to a blue train because they said the children would recognize that as the blue train of Southern Africa. Great, wonderful, we changed that with alacrity. But when they asked us to remove the book, Wally the Wave, which is a book about anger, a wave turning into a tidal wave, and I said, absolutely not. Why would we remove this book? And they said, because we're a landlocked country. We don't have sea. So the children will not know what a sea is. And I said, no problem. We will adapt the lesson plan and the resources. We will show them pictures of a wave and sea, and we will adapt the lesson plan to explain what sea is. But they have to learn about seas and waters if they're going to be global citizens. So it's that kind of tightrope dance.
I ask after, maybe, I want to ask to Marian, you know, the problem of the Pope is a real important problem. So the Pope synthesized this. We need to have an education to put together the language of the mind, the language of the heart, the language of the hands. In what sense the new instrument that you know, and you have some experience to practice this with the people, can be useful to communicate this idea of the Pope, the program of the Pope?
So I have to be very specific. So as you know, I have two completely different directions of my work. One is the use of digital technology to teach precursors of literacy, and the other is to teach, not to teach, to raise to an awareness of our growing knowledge about the threats through digital technology to critical analysis. On the second, is that the question, the second area? How do we teach this kind of cognitive patience and purpose? And I'm actually going to return to my colleague, Professor Gomez. I think one of the most important lessons that I am learning from the extensive research that's coming is that we need to have a sense of what is the purpose of our reading. We need to have that taught from early on. And we also, this is a more subtle response, and and I will talk more with you over tea, but there's a phenomenon that I think that I call cognitive patience, that I think we all need to remind ourselves. We have a kind of, if you will, sanctuary of thought inside ourselves that we are neglecting because we are so impatient to virtuously deal with the bombardment of information and not realize we need time to think about it. So if you will, it's how do we discipline ourselves to learn, to relearn the cognitive patience that I think we have all insidiously begun to lose.
I can't resist just showing you this. Head, heart, and hands, Marcelo. Head,
That's good.
hearts, and hands.
That's
One of the books from the program. So yes, it's in tune.
Well, thank you so much. I would say we make now our break and reassemble here at 4:45, so that we try to gain a little bit time when we're only 15 minutes late for dinner. And we should always think of the people who prepare our dinner. Thank you so much for these contributions and the questions.
Really good.